Leibele Eiger, known as Leibele Eiger, was born to a very distinguished mitnagdic family, born to a family that was very opposed to the Hasidic movement. He was born into this family in the early part of the 19th century, but by the age of 17, he had heard about the famous yeshiva in Kotzker and had told his father, Rabbi Shlomo Eiger, that he wanted to go to study in Kotzker. His father was rather alarmed by the request and tried to delay him. But Leibele was very persistent and insisted that his father give him permission to go. And as Leibele made preparations to go to Kotzker, his father warned him, "You may go study in Kotzker, but don't become like them." The reason for the warning is that the mitnagdim felt that they had heard many stories about the bizarre behavior of the students in Kotzker. And so Leibele's father wanted to make sure he did not adopt any of their practices or be tainted in any way by some of their perceived bizarre behavior. Leibele arrives in Kotzker in the yeshiva, immediately immerses himself into the learning at the yeshiva. And when Yom Kippur came around, at the conclusion of Kol Nidre and Mariv, Leibele decides that he's going to stay awake all night, immersed in Torah learning. Goes into the Beit Midrash, finds a long bench and a table in the large study hall, and he was alone because everyone else had gone to sleep. It was very quiet. He opened up a volume of the Gemara and started to learn. Suddenly, 3 students of the Rebbe of Kotzker walk into the Beit Midrash, walk over to the table where Leibele was sitting, shove him off the bench rather brusquely, and sit down in his place. Leibele had always known that there was always enough room for everyone, so he decided to move away rather than to protest, especially since this was Yom Kippur night. But the students didn't open any Gemarot, they didn't study. The oldest of the young men asked his companions whether they had made Kiddush yet. Leibele was horrified by the question. The companion said, "No, we haven't made Kiddush yet." The older of the students then tells one of his younger friends to go over to the closet, to get a cup, take a bottle of wine, and bring them to the table. When they come back to the table, they pour the wine into the Kiddush cup. The oldest lifts up the Kiddush cup and is ready to recite the bracha of Kiddush. Leibele was panic-stricken, bewildered. He thought, the Torah commands that every Jew fast on Yom Kippur. What are they doing? Couldn't understand why 3 students of the Kotzker Rebbe were in the Beit Midrash preparing to make Kiddush on Yom Kippur night. So eventually, Leibele could not restrain himself, and he starts to shout, "What are you doing?" And the eldest replies, "Why? What's wrong? Tonight is a Yom Tov, and we are going to make Kiddush." Leibele responds, "But don't you know that Yom Kippur is a fast day?" And the response from the older of the boys is, "So what?" So Leibele demands, "Don't you know that all Jews are supposed to fast on Yom Kippur?" And the older boy says, "Who said so?" And Leibele says, "God says so in his Torah." And the 3 young men fix their gaze on Leibele and say, "Who is God?" A few moments of stunned silence pass. After a full 10 minutes, Leibele, panic-stricken, without the ability to answer the question, the eldest walks over to Leibele, puts his hand on his shoulder and says, "Leibele, you have been in Kotzker for almost an entire year. You still don't know who God is? You haven't learned anything yet." They retreat from the table, take the cup, pour the wine back into the bottle, rinse out the cup in the basin, put everything back in the closet. Leibele was shaken by the entire experience, closed his Gemara, mulled over what had happened, stayed up all night, and by the time dawn arrived, he had decided to become a Kotzker chasid, and eventually became a very great, distinguished Hasidic master and rebbe. On Yom Kippur, we begin with Kol Nidre, and we end with the blast of the shofar after Tfilat Neilah. Some have suggested that the reason that we start with Kol Nidre is that Kol Nidre really is a beit din. It is a human court that uses the vehicle of the prayer of Kol Nidre to annul our vows of the past year, to prepare us for the spirit of tshuva on Yom Kippur. Some have suggested that we convene a human court because our sages have told us that there is a promise from Hashem that when a human court assembles, Hashem promises that He will be present. So in a sense, we are forcing God's presence from the heavens above to us below, and plead with Hashem to stay with us for these 25 hours as we engage in tshuva and vidui. And it seems to be that our task, aside from all the other obligations of the day, is to be able to at least begin to answer the question of who is God. And that by the time we reach the blast of the shofar, which announces the ascent of Hashem back to heaven, and we yell at the top of our voices, Hashem Hu HaElokim 3 times, that we begin at least, because of the inspiration of the lofty poetry of the liturgy, to know more about God's compassionate character and merciful nature, that at least we can begin to answer the question, who is God? Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova to all.